I showed up to my former boss's retirement gala in a blazer I bought for $11 at a Goodwill in Tempe, Arizona. I want you to picture that for a second. The Meridian Hotel ballroom in downtown Phoenix. The kind of place where the chandeliers alone cost more than my first car. Women in floor-length gowns. Men in tuxedos that were probably hand-tailored somewhere in Italy, and me, standing at the entrance in a navy blazer with a small snag near the left cuff that I'd fixed with clear nail polish that morning, holding a glass of sparkling water because the open bar had a line and I didn't feel like waiting. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about that. My coworker Joanna had forwarded me the invitation 3 weeks earlier with a message that said, "You know you don't have to, right?" And I'd stared at my laptop screen for probably 10 minutes thinking about whether I had the stomach for it. Because the man being celebrated that night, the man whose name was printed in gold foil on every centerpiece, whose face was on the 4-foot banner near the entrance, was the same man who had spent 4 years taking credit for everything I built. His name was Preston Holt, and until 11 months before that gala, he had been my direct supervisor at Landmark Consulting Group. Let me back up. I came to Landmark fresh out of my MBA program at Arizona State. 26 years old, first-generation college graduate, the kind of person who'd grown up watching her mother work double shifts at a hospital laundry just to keep the lights on. I understood what it meant to earn something. I understood it in my bones. So when I got that job offer, junior analyst position, not glamorous, not particularly well paid, but a foot in the door at one of the top mid-market consulting firms in the Southwest, I treated it like the most important thing that had ever happened to me. Preston noticed me early. That's what I told myself anyway. He pulled me into his team within the first 2 months, started including me in client meetings, asked for my input on strategy presentations. I thought it meant I was talented. I thought it meant he saw something real in me. What it actually meant was that he'd found someone who would do the hard work without asking for the recognition. For almost 4 years, I wrote the frameworks. I built the financial models. I drafted the client-facing reports, the internal memos, the PowerPoint decks that got sent to the C-suite. Preston would review my drafts, change a few words here and there, sometimes rearrange a chart, and then present everything to leadership as if he'd been sitting alone in his office working through the night. I was almost never in those rooms. And when I was introduced as my analyst, never by name, never with a specific contribution acknowledged. It took me embarrassingly long to understand what was happening. I kept telling myself he was mentoring me, that this was just how the industry worked, that my time would come. I told myself that until the day I found out he'd been promoted to Senior Vice President, a promotion that was built almost entirely on the Meridian West Development Project. A 47-page strategic restructuring plan that I had written from scratch over 3 months while Preston was in Scottsdale attending a conference. I remember the exact moment I found out. I was eating lunch at my desk. Turkey sandwich, bag of pretzels, the kind of lunch you eat when you haven't had time to think about food. And my colleague from the finance team, a quiet guy named Bart, leaned over and said, "Hey, congrats on the Meridian West thing, by the way." Preston's VP announcement basically quoted your whole framework. I asked him what he meant. He showed me the internal announcement email on his phone. Preston's name. Preston's vision. Preston's vision. The exact language I had used in my executive summary, the part about phased capital reallocation with stakeholder-aligned benchmarks, quoted verbatim, attributed to his years of industry insight. I sat with that for a long time. Longer than I should have, honestly. I didn't explode. I didn't march into his office. I didn't go to HR that afternoon with a list of grievances, even though I had plenty of documentation and probably should have. Instead, I went home that night, I made a pot of coffee, and I opened a new folder on my personal laptop. I called it PRH, Preston R. Holt, and I started putting things in it. Every email where I'd sent him a draft and he'd replied with, "Great, I'll take it from here." Every version history on the shared drive that showed my name as the original author. Every Slack message where he'd asked me to clean up a framework that I had actually written from the ground up. The metadata on every file. The timestamps. I'm a consultant. I know how to build a case. Here's what I also did. I kept doing my job. I kept doing it well, maybe even better than before, because I needed Preston to keep trusting me with the high visibility work. I needed him comfortable. I needed him careless. And I started quietly building relationships of my own. Not dramatically, not in a way that would tip him off. Just conversations with clients after meetings, a follow-up email here and there, getting to know the names of people at Landmark who actually made decisions. About 7 months after the Meridian West situation, I got a message on LinkedIn from a woman named Sandra Cho. She was the director of operations at a mid-size healthcare logistics company called ClearPath, and she'd been referred to me by a client I'd worked with 2 years earlier. She wanted to know if I did independent consulting. She said specifically, "We want the person who actually does the thinking, not just the person whose name is on the deck." I don't know how she knew. But she knew. I took a week to think about it. Then I gave my notice at Landmark. Preston's response, when I told him I was leaving, was so perfectly revealing that I almost laughed in his face. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, I hope you know what you're walking away from. Not everyone can operate at this level without the right support structure." He said it like he was doing me a favor. Like I should be worried. I thanked him for his time and walked out of his office for the last time. That was 11 months before the gala. In those 11 months, I'd built ClearPath a full operational restructuring plan that saved them roughly $2.3 million in annual overhead. Sandra had referred me to 2 other companies. I had signed a 3rd client on my own. I was working 60-hour weeks out of a spare bedroom in my apartment, but I was working for myself, and every single thing I produced had my name on it. And then Joanna forwarded me that invitation. Preston Holt, after 31 years at Landmark Consulting Group, was being honored at a formal retirement gala. He was being given the firm's Lifetime Achievement Award. The invitation described his career as a masterclass in strategic leadership and client service. I thought about everything sitting in that PRH folder on my laptop. I said yes. The night of the gala, I drove myself to the Meridian in my 2019 Honda Civic and handed my keys to the valet. The valet looked at my car and then at me with an expression that managed to convey both neutrality and judgment simultaneously. I smiled at him and walked inside. The ballroom was exactly as overwhelming as I'd expected. Maybe 200 people. The kind of crowd where everyone knows each other and the small talk has the specific texture of people who've been in the same industry long enough to be both colleagues and competitors. I recognized a few faces from my Landmark days. Most of them gave me the polite nod of people who remember you but can't quite place why. I found Joanna near the appetizer table and we hugged. She looked at my blazer. "You look great," she said, which was kind. "I found it at Goodwill," I said. She laughed like she thought I was joking. I wasn't. I spent the first hour working the room carefully, not aggressively. I wasn't there to network exactly, but I wanted to be seen. I wanted to be present and composed and unremarkable, so that when the evening went sideways, no one could say I'd been lurking or scheming. I was just a former employee who'd come to pay respects. The picture of professional courtesy. I saw Preston across the room around 7:30. He was holding court near the bar, surrounded by a group of senior partners laughing at something someone had said. He'd gotten a haircut. He was wearing a suit that probably cost $4,000. He looked, I had to admit, exactly like a man who had spent 31 years being celebrated for work he hadn't done. He saw me. I watched the moment he registered who I was. A small flicker of something behind his eyes, quickly replaced by his professional smile. He raised his glass at me from across the room. I raised mine back. We didn't speak. The program started at 8. Dinner first, salmon or filet, choice of 2, served at round tables with name cards. I was seated near the back, which I'd expected. Fine by me. Better angle. The speeches began around 8:45. The managing partner of Landmark, a silver-haired man named Gerald. Wait, I should check that. A silver-haired man I'll call the firm's founder, stood up and spent 15 minutes talking about Preston's career. Strategic vision. Client relationships, the Meridian West project. He used the phrase Preston's landmark work, which I think was intended as a pun and landed exactly as well as you'd expect. I kept my face completely still. Then it was time for the award. Preston walked to the podium to a standing ovation. He paused, looked around the room with that particular expression of practiced humility that very powerful men perfect over decades, and began to speak. He talked about his early days at the firm. He talked about the teams he'd built and the talent he'd developed. He talked about Meridian West, described it as my crowning achievement, a framework I developed over 3 months of intensive client engagement. 3 months. Intensive. His framework. I was sitting very still. Under the table, my right hand was holding my phone, and on my phone was an email I had drafted 3 days earlier and not yet sent. Let me explain what was in that email. About 6 weeks after I'd left Landmark, I'd been contacted by a former ClearPath board member named Victor, an older gentleman who'd left the board the year before but still kept his ear to the ground. He'd reached out because he'd heard I was doing independent work, and he'd also heard, through channels I won't pretend to fully understand, that a junior analyst at Landmark was being pressured to backdate document metadata on several high-profile project files. That junior analyst was a 24-year-old named Kelsey. She'd come to Landmark 18 months after I left. She'd been assigned to Preston's team. She'd been given the same treatment I'd gotten. Brilliant work, invisible credit. And unlike me, she'd pushed back. And unlike me, she'd been told very clearly that if she wanted to keep her job, she'd cooperate. I called Kelsey. It took 3 conversations before she trusted me enough to talk honestly. What she told me was detailed, specific, and damning. She had copies of things. So did I. Between the two of us, we had a paper trail that was, frankly, airtight. I'd spent the weeks before the gala consulting with an employment attorney, not to file anything, not yet, just to understand what we had. The attorney had been very clear about what the documentation showed: systematic misappropriation of intellectual property, coercion of a junior employee, and, potentially most importantly, fraud. Because 2 of the projects where Preston had claimed sole authorship had been used in Landmark's own marketing materials and pitch decks, which meant they'd made material representations to prospective clients based on falsified credentials. I had sent everything to Landmark's general counsel 4 days before the gala. I had also sent a summary to 3 journalists who cover the consulting industry, with the note that I'd have more to say after the weekend. And I had sent a copy to the chair of Landmark's board of directors, a woman named Dr. Adezo Okonkwo, who I knew, because Joanna had told me, was already unhappy with how the senior leadership team had handled 2 previous complaints from junior employees. The email on my phone was to Kelsey. It just said, "It's starting. You okay?" I sent it while Preston was at the podium describing my work as his own for an audience of 200 people. She replied in 30 seconds, "I'm okay. I've got my phone on." Preston finished his speech. More applause. The managing partner handed him a crystal award that was probably custom-made and cost what I paid in rent. Preston held it up and grinned. I clapped. I clapped genuinely with both hands because I had done everything I needed to do already. And sitting in that ballroom, watching him hold up that award, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Calm. Not the forced kind, not the kind you perform when you're actually seething underneath. The real kind. The kind that comes when you finish doing the hard, patient, meticulous work, and you know that what happens next is no longer in your hands. What happened next was not in my hands, and it happened faster than I expected. I hadn't planned anything dramatic for that evening. The whole point was that I didn't have to. I'd submitted the documentation. I'd done the work. The gala wasn't my stage, it was just a place where I happened to be standing when everything started to move. But here's what I hadn't anticipated. Dr. Okonkwo was at the gala. She was seated 2 tables from the front, and I hadn't seen her when I'd come in. I found out later that she'd received my package on Thursday, had spent Friday and Saturday reviewing it with 2 members of the board's audit committee, and had arrived at the gala on Sunday evening with the firm's outside legal counsel, who was sitting next to her, not looking at the salmon. I didn't know any of this was happening until Joanna grabbed my arm under the table and whispered, very quietly, "Something is happening with the board table." I looked over. Dr. Okonkwo was on her phone. The outside counsel had leaned over and was saying something to the managing partner's assistant. The managing partner himself was speaking with someone at the back of the room, a man I didn't recognize, in a dark suit, who had the specific posture of someone delivering information that is not good. Preston was still at the podium, finishing a toast. The managing partner walked back to the front of the room. He touched Preston's arm. Preston looked at him. The managing partner said something very quietly, and Preston's face did something I'd never seen it do in 4 years of working for him. It went blank. Not angry, not defensive, just blank. Like a man who had just received news that his whole story was about to be told by someone other than him. The managing partner said calmly into the microphone that they would be taking a brief intermission. He thanked everyone for their patience. He said the program would continue shortly. It did not continue shortly. I sat at my table for another 20 minutes while at the front of the room a quiet and devastating series of conversations took place. Dr. Okonkwo, the counsel. Preston, the managing partner. At some point, a woman I recognized as Landmark's head of HR came in through a side door, which was a detail I found almost impressive. Someone had called her specifically for a retirement gala on a Sunday night, which told you something about how seriously they were taking what I'd sent them. Joanna kept looking at me. I kept eating my dinner. The salmon was actually quite good. The managing partner came back to the microphone at about 9:45. He was composed, but his composure had the texture of something being held together with effort. He said that due to some administrative matters that require immediate attention, the remainder of the evening's program would be postponed. He thanked the guests. He thanked the hotel staff. He said Landmark would be in touch with further information. Preston was not standing next to him when he said it. Preston had already left the room. I want to be careful here because I'm not the kind of person who takes pleasure in watching someone get destroyed. That's not what this is. Or it's not only that. What happened to Preston in the weeks that followed was significant, and it was the direct result of documentation that I and Kelsey, whose contribution I want to be absolutely clear about, had assembled carefully and honestly. The Lifetime Achievement Award was quietly rescinded. An internal review was announced. 2 of the project files that had been submitted to prospective clients were pulled from Landmark's marketing materials. Kelsey hired an employment attorney and filed a formal complaint, which I won't go into detail about because it's her story to tell. Preston retired as planned, but under conditions that looked nothing like the celebration that had been prepared for him. The Meridian West project, my Meridian West project, was officially reattributed in Landmark's internal records. I was sent a letter by the board's counsel acknowledging my authorship and expressing, in very careful legal language, the firm's regret for any professional harm I had experienced. I forwarded that letter to my own attorney and also, I'll be honest, saved it in a folder I renamed from PRH to Done. ClearPath promoted me, not officially, since I work for myself, but Sandra called me the week after everything became public and said, I just want you to know. This changes nothing about how we see you. Actually, it confirms it. That phone call meant more to me than the letter. The 3 journalists I'd contacted ran pieces over the following 2 weeks. None of them were sensational. They were careful, sourced, accurate. One of them was picked up by a national business publication. It generated the kind of quiet industry conversation that, in consulting, tends to stick around. My phone got busier after that. I'm not going to pretend that's not connected. I drove home from the Meridian Hotel that night at about 10:15 after saying goodbye to Joanna, after returning my valet ticket, after one last look at the ballroom where everything had just shifted permanently. The drive home was about 20 minutes on a highway that was mostly empty that late on a Sunday. I had the windows down because it was warm the way Phoenix is always warm, even at night, even in November. I thought about my mother. I thought about her working the night shift at that hospital laundry when I was in high school, coming home at 6 in the morning smelling like industrial detergent and still making breakfast for me before I went to school. I thought about what I would tell her when I called her the next day, which I already knew would involve her saying something like, I always knew, in that quiet way of hers that manages to be both simple and the most meaningful thing I've ever heard. I thought about Kelsey, 24 years old, sitting somewhere tonight with her phone in her hand, having done something genuinely brave. I thought about the blazer I was wearing. $11. Goodwill on Scottsdale Road, a Tuesday morning 3 weeks earlier, when I'd gone in looking for a fall jacket and found this instead. I'd tried it on in the narrow fitting room with its fluorescent light and thought, yeah, this works. The snag near the cuff was invisible from more than 2 feet away. No one at that gala knew what I'd paid for it. No one could have looked at me that evening and seen anything other than a woman who belonged exactly where she was. That's the thing about value, real value. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It just holds up over time. It survives being overlooked, being borrowed without credit, being underestimated by men in $4,000 suits who genuinely believe that possession is the same thing as creation. It holds up. I merged onto my exit ramp, turned down a street lined with saguaros that caught the light from passing cars, and pulled into my apartment complex just before 10:30. I sat in the car for a minute with the engine off. Then I picked up my phone and called my mom. People ask me sometimes if I regret waiting so long. Almost 4 years of doing work that someone else took credit for, 4 years of watching my frameworks get repackaged, my language get borrowed, my thinking get presented to rooms I wasn't even allowed to sit in, and the honest answer is no. Not because it didn't hurt, it did, but because the waiting wasn't passive. That's the part people misunderstand. Preston didn't fall because I got lucky, or because the universe decided to balance the books on my behalf at some cosmically convenient moment. He fell because actions accumulate. Every email he sent me asking for a draft and then forwarding it as his own, that accumulated. Every time he stood at a podium and used my exact words and let 200 people believe they were his, that accumulated. The Meridian West projects didn't vanish just because his name was on it. The original files were still there. The timestamps were still there. The truth has a way of staying put even when you try to bury it under someone else's signature. What Kelsey did, was simply stop letting that accumulation stay invisible. I think about her a lot, actually. 24 years old, newer to the industry than I was, under more direct pressure than I'd ever experienced, because she tried to push back and been told exactly what that would cost her. It would have been so easy for her to decide that compliance was survival. A lot of people make that choice. I'm not here to judge them for it. I understand the math of it, especially when you're young and the rent is due and the person with the power over your career is standing right in front of you telling you how this is going to go. But Kelsey kept her copies. She kept them quietly, carefully, the way you keep something when some part of you already knows you might need it someday. That's not luck either. That's a kind of integrity that operates even when no one is watching and no one is going to give you credit for it in the moment. I wore an $11 blazer to that gala. And I want to be clear, that wasn't a statement. I wasn't trying to make a point about materialism or prove something to the room. I wore it because I found it. It fit well, and I had work to do that evening that had nothing to do with what I was wearing. The blazer held up fine. The snag near the cuff was invisible from 2 feet away. What I keep coming back to is this. Preston had $4,000 on his back, and 31 years of accumulated recognition and a Crystal Award with his name on it. And none of that was load-bearing. The moment the documentation surfaced, all of it became decoration on a structure that had never been sound. Your actual work is the only thing that holds. Not the title, not the award, not the way a room applauds when you walk to a podium. The work itself, the thinking, the honesty, the willingness to build something real even when someone else is going to take the credit for it. That stays. It stays in file metadata and email threads and the memory of every person who actually watched you do it. Preston spent 31 years collecting the surface of other people's labor. I spent 4 years building something that couldn't be taken away from me even when someone tried. That's the difference, and eventually the difference shows.